A fortune teller, gazing into her crystal ball, said this to a frog: "You are going to meet a beautiful young woman. From the moment she sets eyes on you, she will have an insatiable desire to know all about you. She will be compelled to get close to you. You will fascinate her." To that the frog replied, "Well, where am I? Am I at a singles mixer?" The fortune teller replied, "No, actually, you're in a biology class." Some of us today, when we see today's topic, might think, I don't want to know too much about my future, because sometimes I worry about what it holds. Rest assured, that's not our focus today. Today, all we really want to do is this. As we journey again into James, we want to think about what it means to face our future in a way that leads us to embrace the future that God really wants for us. A future that, regardless of any struggles we might face, a future that is full of hope and joy and meaning and purpose and good works. I ran across this quote a few years ago, and I want us to start out today by thinking about it a bit. Here's the quote or the thought: if we're focused on our past, then we're going to trip over our present, and we're going to fall into our future. Again, if we're focused on our past, we're going to trip over our present and fall into our future. Several years ago now, I took my family to Hollywood Studios. During our time there, in addition to riding a bunch of roller coasters, we love them, checking out all that the park had to offer, we went to the two really major shows that they were offering at that time. One was an Indiana Jones kind of thing, pretty cool. But then the other one was more of an espionage theme, the good guys chasing the bad guys. It was a blast, and I want you to see just a little bit of what was going on with these cars and these drivers. Give a look and a listen. Surprise you in a few moments with, I need to watch the videos ahead of time. Now I was going to surprise you with how it was done. You can probably guess. While the Indiana Jones show blew us away, it was amazing as well. It's this show that really came to mind more so, and especially these cars, when I thought about today's topic. Again, imagine being there live. You don't know the trick at all. You're watching these cars tearing around, and I mean, this is part of it, but it was incredible what they did. Jumping through the flaming hoop, we probably should have had at least the picture up here. But as the audience, when you're watching them dart behind a building, looking like they're going into another part of the city, and they come back moving that fast in reverse, immediately you are thinking amazing drivers, right? You know, how would you do that? I have trouble enough as I'm backing out here knowing if people are, we have blind spots. How in the world could they do that, we were thinking. And then, you know, we learned after the show what you just learned. There was no trick to it. It was an illusion, right? Because that seat would swivel. Now, I didn't know until we did watch that he had fake arms. That was a nice touch, wasn't it? Now, here's why this is, though, what spoke to me most in terms of today's topic. Because I realize when it comes to your future and mine, right, there are no tricks that we can turn to if we're trying to move ahead in life while we're looking back the whole time. So today what we want to talk about today is this: why the very best way to face our future is by embracing our future, facing it head on. One more time, if we're focused on our past, if we're looking behind us, we're going to trip over our present and we're going to fall into our future. And knowing that's not what we want. Today we look to James for advice as to how we can best avoid that. Here's our core passage for today, James 4:13 through 17. If you want to follow along on your phone, on your Bible, we'll have these up on the screen as well. So James chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast and brag. All such boasting is evil. Anyone then who knows the good he ought to do and doesn't do it sins. Here's what's real. God has a bright future He wants for each and every one of us. And yet to truly embrace that future, there are certain things James would tell us that we must not do. And so in our time together today, that's exactly what we want to take a look at. These things we need to make sure we don't do if we have any hope of facing our future really well. Here are three things James says we've got to avoid. First, he says, in order to face our future well, first we've got to make sure we never ever do this. We never plan our lives without God. We never plan our future without consulting Him. I think this first thought in many ways is illustrated in verse 13. Hear these words again. Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Honestly, I think all of us can hear those words, can read those words, and we can easily think, hey, that sounds a lot like our lives. We look at the year ahead of us, and we say, quite simply, here's what I'm going to do. Here are my plans over the next 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. In other words, here's why I say that. In other words, I think it's very easy for us to look at that particular verse and think, this is not a problem. So why perhaps is he speaking of it that way? We can look at this and think this isn't a problem unless we can begin to pick up on what James is really getting at here. Because here's what he's really saying. The problem lies not in the planning ahead. The problem here lies in what's missing when it comes to our planning. Because here we find absolutely no mention of God at all. Here we find no mention of someone saying, okay, God, here's my calendar. Are these the priorities you want for me? Okay, God, as I rise this day, what would you have me do? No mention of God at all. That's the problem. Alexander Saul, a Russian historian, once wrote, since I have spent nearly 50 years working on the history of the Russian Revolution, in the process, I've collected hundreds of personal testimonies. I've read hundreds of books. I've contributed 8 volumes of my own. But if I were asked today to formulate as precisely as possible the main cause of the ruinous revolution that swallowed up some 60 million Russians, I could not put it more accurately than to repeat the phrase, men have forgotten God. Now, if James here has led us to a problem we all face, trying to go it alone, then the solution, while rather obvious, must still be stated and embraced. And the solution, simply put, is this: daily, as we think about our future, as we set goals for our future, in the midst of all of that, daily we simply do need to include God in our planning. Now again, I think any of us hearing that today in this moment might say, makes sense, I'll do it. So why is it often, most often actually I think, that we don't do that? Before we leave this first thought, knowing that is often the case, for some of us usually the case, I want us to take a moment and consider why that's often the case. Because what it all comes down to is this: whether we do or don't truly lean on God's guidance, it all comes down to this: how we choose to respond to God's will in our life, how we choose to relate to God's will. For example, sometimes when it comes to God's will, you know that you do this, I know that I do this, hopefully it's not super often, but sometimes when it comes to God's will, our response is simply this: we commit to making reference to it. We say, God, I believe you have a will for my life, and here's what I promise you. When I feel like I kind of need to turn to it, I will, right? From time to time, I'll look to your will for me. How many of us, having lived kind of week after week planning without God, how many of us at the first sign of trouble, boy, that's when we really pray and we really mean it, and we say, God, I need your help in this matter. What would you have me do? And what is that? That's simply making reference to God's will from time to time. It's not something that will truly pull God into our goal setting. One notch up, we might say, is another possible response. We can show deference to God's will, meaning we can truly honor God's will. We can say, God, I know that your will for me is sacred. I want to honor it in this life, but if that honoring only takes place through our words and maybe our praying, but no action is ever connected to that, then more than likely we'll still continue to plan without truly leaning on God's guidance, which leads us to a third response, another option that is always at our disposal, meaning when it comes to God's will, we can in fact intentionally show preference for it. That strategy will always lead us time and time again to say to God in the midst of facing our future, not in the midst of crisis only, but to say to God when we rise, to say to God when we plan ahead, to say to God as we face our future, God, I do want your will, not mine. I want that to be what I prefer in this life. I mean it, God. So help me tap into that as I dream about the days and the years ahead. Ask yourself with this first thought today: are you in fact doing a lot of planning in life without consulting God? How might it change your life completely if instead of beating yourself up over that today, how might it change your life completely if you simply change that? If you begin to pay more attention to God's voice, God's leading. Secondly, James says, in order to face our future well, secondly, we've got to make sure we never do this. We never presume when it comes to tomorrow. We never make presumptions when it comes to what the future might bring. James writes this in verse 14. I want to start with a part again of verse 13, and then I'll move us into verse 14. He writes, "Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow I'll do this or that. Why, you don't even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life?" Hear this. "You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes." Notice two really important things he says here. First, James reminds us here, rightly so, that life's unpredictable. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And yet notice this, he's saying to us, instead of letting that just kind of frighten us, intimidate us, shut us down, he says, instead of that, let that fact of life, the unpredictability of life, man, let that just drive you into God's arms all the more. Let that just push you all the more to trust God. I love this from Corrie ten Boom, and I think I've got it up on the screen. Love this. I think she speaks to this so beautifully. Never be afraid to trust an unknown future to a known God. Say that with me. Never be afraid to trust an unknown future to a known God. First image he gives us, life is unpredictable. So he says, just lean on God all the more. But then he also says this. Notice this as well. Here James also very directly says this. You are a mist. He doesn't mean to denigrate us, though I think it feels like that sometimes. He's not trying to put us down. He's not trying to say you're worthless, or that you really are insignificant. Instead, he's simply meaning this, reminding us of this fact of life. Life's not only unpredictable, it's brief, isn't it? It is. Some of the most beautiful moments my family and I have spent when we've been in the North Carolina mountains. And I wonder if almost all of you have experienced this as well. Perhaps not. But some of the most beautiful times were found when the mist was just kind of all around us. And some of you, as I look out upon you, you've experienced this in other places as well. The mist is just there, hanging over the lake or hanging in the mountains, all around me. And those are some of the most beautiful times, but there are also those moments where we kind of say to each other, come on out, we better enjoy it, because what do we know? It's not going to last, right? Going to burn off, going to be gone. Far from driving us to despair, when he says that about our lives, knowing how mist works, what James hopes this understanding of life will do for us is simply this. It'll push us to make the most of each and every day. It will cause us to more intentionally live one day at a time. Remember the quote we started with today, once we got past the poor frog and his soon-to-be relationship. The quote we started with today, if you're focused on your past, then you're going to trip over your present. I think James here simply adds this to that thought. Also, if you're overly worried about your future, that too will cause you to trip over your present. And so his solution, again, is a way of defeating that fear, that worry. His solution is simply make the most of today. Jesus certainly echoes that sentiment. In the Gospel of Matthew 6:34 says this, words of Jesus, don't be anxious about tomorrow, live one day at a time. Lastly, James says, if we want to face our future well, and here's a third thing not to do. Don't put off doing good. Verse 17, anyone then who knows the good he ought to do and doesn't do it sins. I think most of the time when we think of sin, we think of all the thou shalt nots. We do. We think of all those things we should not do. Truth is, sin also really does come in the form of not doing the good we know we could have done. John Wesley, who long ago created a movement that grew into what we now know as Methodism, he said this, and I'm certainly paraphrasing, but he said this to some degree. In addition to avoiding sin, he said we should also do all the good we can in all the ways we can for all the days we can. And he said that in part because of James' message here, a message that reminds us we don't just shortchange our future. When we do the wrong thing, we also shortchange our future, or we fail to face our future well when we choose not to do the right thing. So what can keep us from getting caught up in this? 3 simple but powerful words: do it now. Meaning, again, never put off for tomorrow the good you know you can do today. A while back, the Peace Corps had a commercial, and it offered the following thought: it doesn't matter how long you live if you're not doing anything with your life. And that's what James is reminding us here. I think it's fair to say most of us are not as prepared for tomorrow as we'd like to be. Not thinking hurricane season. I'm going deeper than that. What we're trying to do with our life, how we're trying to embrace the future that God has for us. I think most of us are not as prepared for tomorrow as we'd like to be. So paying attention here to James' warnings. Today we've got to begin to think about these kinds of questions. One, will we commit today more and more to truly including God in our goal setting? Not just referring to God's will from time to time, but truly making it our preference. And then further, will we commit today to doing a better job of living one day at a time, doing all the good we can today, not just out there in the future at some point? Hey, here's to facing our future well. Let's pray.